Hello, and welcome to another one of these fun little lecture things. This one is all about heritability. We're going to talk a little bit about how we actually figure out whether or not a behavior is heritable. And this is actually a question that Lucretia brought up in class the other day. Like, how do we know if something is caused by genes or if it's got roots in other sets of things, like learning, like other sets of um, originations. So that's kind of what we're going to talk about. And the reason for that is that if we're going to talk about selection being able to act on a behavior, then there has to be a heritable component to that behavior. Selection only acts on things that can be passed down from one generation to the next. So how do we actually determine if a behavior is heritable? And then what other factors can cause behavioral traits if it's not due to heritability? We'll get into that a little bit. So that's where we're going in this one. So there are actually a number of ways that we could actually look at sort of the root causes of behavior. We could do some sort of gene screening. We could look for the presence or absence of certain sets of genes. We could actually do some sequencing. Those become really time consuming and actually really expensive mechanisms. So they're getting cheaper, expensive ways to look at behavior. So some of the more traditional methods for doing this involve the selection experiments. Um, and one of these kinds of selection experiments is called a truncation experiment. So if you imagine a situation where we can calculate the average score of a particular behavior. In this case, they have it sort of described as a novel approach score. So this is how long it takes for an individual to approach something new. Um, if the population average is 60 seconds, we can sort of calculate that. We can calculate a distribution of all of these traits within the population. A truncation experiment says, actually, we're going to look at this population and we're going to manipulate their reproduction. So in generation one, what you see here is the distribution of approach scores across this population. If we have these individuals in captivity, we can say, all right, this is the population average. We're only going to let these individuals who have approach scores that are longer reproduce. So if we say the average value of the average approach score of individuals who actually reproduce is 90 seconds, then that's actually a very different average than the population average. So the differential, what we call S, the selection differential between the average reproductive individuals in the population and the average total score of the population is 30 seconds. Okay. So that selection differential, there you go. Difference between the average trait of breeders in the population and the average trait of the whole population. So now we let these individuals breed and we look to see what happens to their offspring. What are the traits in their offspring in the next generation? Offspring in generation 2. What we see is here is the original population average of 60. Here is the new population average. The actual scores have changed. The actual distribution of traits in that population has changed. That is the response to selection. But remember, the average value of the traits for individuals who reproduced was 90 seconds. The average value of the traits of their offspring is 70 seconds. That means that offspring don't have exactly the same trait that their parents do with respect to this approach measure. There's a change in their distribution of traits from previous populations, but it is not identical to it. So that's saying, like, all right, this is a behavior that has a heritable component. But the heritable component of this behavior is not the only thing that affects this trait. That is the heritability. So this h squared is a unit that we use to describe a variable that we call heritability. Heritability in this case can be calculated by this response to selection divided by the selection differential. So h squared equals 0.33. That's saying that about a third of this trait, about a third of this behavioral trait, or rather, about a third of the variation in this behavioral trait is due to genetic differences. Let me say that one more time. About a third of the variation in this behavioral trait is due to genetic differences. These kinds of truncation experiments are one of the common ways that people have looked at heritability studies. There are other ways that people can do this, and they will do sometimes parent-offspring regressions, where they compare the trait of parents to the traits of their offspring to look at how well or how closely they align with each other. But there's a problem if you look at, say, parents and offspring who are staying together over longer periods of time. So they have calculated this one with the biological midpoint and beak depth. Beak depth from top to bottom is a measure of beak size in birds, and so they looked at the average value of the parents and compared that to the offspring beak depth. And what they find is that, this lines up pretty closely. R squared is about 0.496, so about 49% of the variation in this trait is due to genetic differences. The rest of it is due to other sets of factors. One way that people have tried to separate out the implications of being reared together of parents and offspring is to do these cross-fostering experiments. Cross-fostering experiments involve taking the offspring away and having them raised by different parents, because that can isolate or control for the effects of a shared environment. So, if we think about what we just did, we're looking at the sort of genetic components of heritability. Heritability here is really this sort of h squared variable that we were mentioning before, is actually a measure of the amount of variation in a trait in a population that's due to genetic differences over or divided by the total phenotypic variation. And if we look at total phenotypic variation, well, total phenotypic variation is a function of both genetic differences and environmental differences, or variation due to environmental differences. Heritability is really a way to look at the effects of genetic differences on behavioral traits within a population. It is always between 0 and 1. If it is 0, then all the variation in a trait in a population is due to entirely environmental differences. If it is greater than 0, then any trait variation in that population is due to a combination of genetic differences and environmental differences. If heritability is 1, that means the entire or all the variation in that trait in the population is due to genetic differences between individuals. This one is a mouthful. This conceptually is weirdly challenging, so ask questions about this, read up on it in the book, and there's more. All right.